This video will help you understand the difference between designating your beneficiaries as primary beneficiaries per capita or per Stirpes. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. In the world of estate planning, on top of simply naming beneficiaries, whether it's primary or contingent or whatever, you're oftentimes given the option to select those primary beneficiaries as being primary beneficiaries per capita, also sometimes called pro rata, or designating them per Stirpes. And there's a big difference between the two. And so in today's video, I figured it'd be helpful to break down the differences and ultimately show how they could have a drastic impact on your estate plan. So let's jump in. Now, when you set up a retirement account, IRA, Roth IRA, 401k, life insurance plan, etc., you're oftentimes given the ability to select a primary beneficiary, a contingent beneficiary, and then sometimes if you wanted to, you could throw in a tertiary, quaternary, or quinary beneficiary with some addendum, whatever, ad infinitum to as many beneficiaries as you want to. However, depending on whether you select those beneficiaries as beneficiaries per capita or per Stirpes, that's going to have a huge impact on your estate plan and who actually would end up getting the money if one of the primary beneficiaries passes away before you do. And depending on which one you select, it might not even matter who you pick as your contingent beneficiary. Allow me to explain. Let's first start with what I think is the most common and probably the default option you should pick for how you want your primary beneficiaries to be labeled, and that says pro rata or per capita. Those terms are interchangeable, so you'll hear me kind of use both in this video. Pro rata, translated from the Latin, is basically in proportion. Let's say you pick 3 primary beneficiaries and you decide to evenly split the proceeds if you pass away, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Well, a per capita or pro rata designation would say if one of the beneficiaries passes away before you do, and you don't make time to go update these documents, you want the assets to be split 50-50 between the surviving beneficiaries, the surviving primary beneficiaries. Essentially what's happening is the beneficiary who was going to inherit 1/3 then splits in proportion their 1/3 amongst those other 2 surviving primary beneficiaries. Now, let's say you really didn't look at your beneficiary documents for a long time, or there was some fluke accident and all your primary beneficiaries passed away at the same time or, before you did. Well, then that's where whoever you designated as contingent beneficiaries would step in. At that point, however, though, the contingent beneficiaries would follow all the same rules. If there's 3 of those still alive, then they would split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. However, if one of them passed away and you said, these are my contingent beneficiaries per capita, well, then the remaining 2 contingent beneficiaries would then split 50-50, whatever comes through by way of proceeds. Oftentimes, I have found between the 2 designations, per capita is the easiest one to understand. Per Stirpes, on the other hand, is translated from the Latin as by the branch. And so I think it's easy to visualize like a family tree where, let's say you are the trunk of the tree and you've got, kids that make up the branches that then flow off, and they all have their own branches from their own kids, etc., etc. Going back to the previous example where there were 3 primary beneficiaries, let's just keep it simple and say they're your 3 kids, and you want to divide your life insurance death benefit 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If you elect a per Stirpes designation on your primary beneficiaries, then as opposed to the previous example where if one of the 3 beneficiaries passes away, the other 2 receive their proceeds and split things 50-50, instead, the 1/3 that was going to go to this beneficiary who passed away, their 1/3 of the assets would then go to their heirs. So it would follow along their branch, or by the branch, their inheritance amount would then follow along to their family tree as well. So for example, if that one primary beneficiary had 2 kids and the assets were originally going to be split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, well, now from the beneficiary that passed away, their 2 kids would then split the proceeds of all the estate 1/6, 1/6, and the remaining 2 primary beneficiaries that are still alive would split things continued as 1/3, 1/3. So in total, all the proceeds are still distributed based on the primary beneficiary designations, but since it was a per Stirpes designation, that means by the branch, the 1/3 inheritance going to this primary beneficiary continues on down their lineage. In a per Stirpes designation, the contingent beneficiary doesn't even matter, because assuming all the primary beneficiaries were gone, the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 between those 3 children would still go to their branches, and they would all have to split things up proportionally. 1/3 for this branch, 1/3 for this branch, and then 1/3 for this branch. Let's enter into the Game of Thrones universe for a moment as we do a quick walkthrough of how these two things could play a role. Let's say the Stark family is looking to do some estate planning. I was originally going to use the Lannister family, but as the analogy progressed, spoiler alert, the family tree got a little bit twisted, so I figured the Stark family might be a little bit cleaner of a way of describing what happens based on which designation. So let's say Ricard and Liara are the two grandparents in this example, and they have 4 kids. They've got Brandon, Eddard, Benjen, and Lyanna. So those are their 4 kids. Ed has 5 kids, and Lyanna has 1 kid, Jon Snow. I guess spoiler alert if you didn't know that, but I think the show came out like over a decade ago, so I don't really feel too bad. And I know this isn't the lore, but let's just assume for this example, everybody is still alive. And for example, let's say they're trying to structure all of the Stark wealth, and they're trying to figure out whether or not to designate their beneficiaries as per Stirpes or per capita. Let's say they set up their estate plan and they decided to pick per capita, but before the grandparents passed away, Ed passed away. Given that they elected per capita, also called pro rata, the 25% of the Stark wealth that Ed would have inherited gets split up amongst his 3 other siblings. So now, as opposed to the kids all getting 25% of the Stark wealth, they instead split the assets 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Furthering on this example, if the grandparents outlive all the kids, and spoiler alert, let's just say all the kids are dead, then all the grandkids would then be designated most likely as contingent beneficiaries. Of course, they don't have to choose that, but most of the time people would do something like that. Then all the grandkids would split things up based on however the contingent beneficiaries were decided. Odds are it'd be an even split amongst all the contingent beneficiaries. If, on the other hand, the Stark grandparents decided we want to split up the Stark fortune to our kids per Stirpes, well then their contingent beneficiary doesn't actually matter at all, whoever they pick, because in the same example where let's say Ed predeceases the grandparents, the kids would still split things up 25% for each of them, but since Ed is gone, his 25% then gets further broken apart into 1/5 shares. Essentially, his kids split what he otherwise would have inherited. Ultimately, if Ed passes away before the grandparents do, then the Stark fortune would most likely be distributed 25%, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5%, 25%, 25%. And like I said, the contingent beneficiary doesn't matter because even if what otherwise would have been the contingent beneficiaries, all the grandkids, if one of the grandkids had already predeceased the grandparents, then their 5% share would have been even further divided amongst however many great-grandkids they have, or kids that the grandkids have. And then on we go until everybody inherits the funds. So in general, I think a per capita designation is the most intuitive, and I think that's what most people have in mind when they pick a primary beneficiary and a contingent beneficiary. I think what they're most likely intuitively thinking is, if my primary beneficiary or beneficiaries are gone, here's who I want to get the money. And it may or may not be the next of kin to the primary beneficiary. It might be a friend, a family member, whatever. So by default, I'm a huge fan of recommending per capita distributions. I can absolutely still see a place for per Stirpes, but in general, I think most people intuitively are thinking a per capita designation for their primary beneficiaries. So from a calls to action standpoint, I would say if your current advisor isn't proactively doing this, I'd highly recommend scheduling a time to review your beneficiary designations at least every few years. If you're a DIY financial planner and you handle everything yourself, then similar process, I'd recommend at least every few years taking a look at all your beneficiary designations, and then of course auditing for a per Stirpes or per capita designation based on what is ultimately in your goals for your estate. Now, while things might not change tremendously year to year, I'd say every couple of years it's good to look at this because number one, institutions are fallible. Paperwork gets lost, typos, etc. And so it's a good idea to make sure that the beneficiary designations still match what you originally had planned out. Generally, our office will target a review of beneficiaries in the springtime every couple of years. I think the spring is advantageous because it's after all the family holiday get-togethers when maybe people's opinions have shifted as to who they want to get what assets in the event that they pass away. And so it captures them at a good time to make some prayerful decisions. But of course, it's always smart to pull these documents off the shelf, dust them off, and make sure they still match your intent. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below or get in touch on the website. We'll help you get squared away. Have an awesome rest of your day. We'll talk to you later. Bye.